All right, well, thank you very much to the great team at SCSP for inviting me here. Thank you very much for allowing me to be the first person to be on stage all by myself without a moderator. And it's really great to be here in Texas. I feel very much at home here. The state where I'm from in Australia is not dissimilar. We love steak, we love digging stuff out of the ground, and we love government staying out of our way. So I feel very comfortable here, and hopefully what I'll talk about this morning is useful to you. I really enjoyed the comments by two predecessors on stage, particularly General Rainey. We actually joined the Army in the same year, 1987. I'm a little less accomplished, only retired as a two-star, but everything he said there resonated very much with me. All right, just very quickly, I often find when I travel around the world that people ask me about Australia, and they ask me about the mountains and the snow and the apple strudel. Okay, wrong Australia. This is the correct Australia. Now, the reason it's red is not because of political orientation. The reason it's red is because that's where the dangerous snakes are. So if you don't like dangerous snakes, don't come to Australia. No, please come. We love having tourists here. All right, so the last couple of years, I think we've learned a lot of lessons about what the shape of modern conflict is. Now, many of the lessons are not new. We've learned about politics, we've learned about alliances and diplomacy, both from friendly alliances, whether it's NATO, ANZUS, these kind of things, or our adversaries teaming up together. We've learned about the fight for influence and cognitive warfare. I think we've also learned a lot of lessons about understanding the enemy. The Russians misjudged the Ukrainians, and I think the Chinese will be looking at that very carefully when they look at Taiwan and other countries in the region about can they misjudge us as well, and I think it's very possible. We've learned a lot about mass and the mobilisation of national capacity, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Learned that nuclear weapons still matter. We'd forgotten about them in the post-Cold War world, but they're still out there and people will still use them to threaten us and to deter us from defending democracy and freedom around the world. I think we've also learned that modern war is intersocietal war that's far more integrated than ever. It's not just about military forces and intelligence forces and diplomats. Societies are far more integrated than they've ever been before, and larger parts of society are participating in conflict against each other, whether it's through crowdfunding, the wonderful NAFO movement, which is all about countering Russian misinformation. We've learned about time and strategic patience, and when do we get bored with foreign wars? Now, this isn't a new lesson from Ukraine. We certainly saw it in the 20 years that we were in Afghanistan and other places like Iraq. And finally, we've learned about the enduring importance of leadership, of human beings at the coalface all the way up to the national level. This is something that a robot's never going to provide, and it's something as an enduring part of human existence on this planet. But, as Ben Kenobi said, these aren't the lessons that you're looking for when you came in here today. So what I'm going to talk about are what I call three very important drivers of transformation in modern conflict and modern military and national security organisations: AI, autonomy and adaptation. And each is very important to understand, but the interaction between the three of them is even more crucial for us to appreciate and ensure that we're able to use to realise the great opportunities that both technology and human capacity provide us in the 21st century. This is the world's first FPV drone. Wasn't a radio-controlled B-17 in Europe. It was a US Navy drone developed during the Second World War, deployed and used in the Pacific. It was an uncrewed aircraft controlled by an operator in the back of an Avenger bomber with a TV screen, used against the Japanese at places like Rabaul. Now, eventually they stopped using them because it was actually cheaper to use manned fighter aircraft and fighter bombers. But it was the first example of an FPV drone. So we've seen drones for a very long time indeed. Autonomy and autonomous war is not just about drones. Drones and electronic warfare go hand in hand. They're co-evolutionary partners, and whenever someone talks about drones, you must be also talking about evolution, learning and adaptation, and electronic warfare. They go together. There is no advance with drones without advances in electronic warfare, either offensive or defensive. And we've seen a huge resurgence in the research and the understanding of electronic warfare on the battlefield and beyond in the last 3.5 years. But drones have also enabled something that was previously the preserve of superpowers and major powers in the Cold War, and that is a long-range strike capability. Until recently, only big, powerful countries had the intelligence, had the systems to be able to conduct attacks over thousands of kilometres. The Cambrian explosion in drones that we've seen in the war in Ukraine has resulted in a lowering of the bar in access to sophisticated long-range strike capabilities. And as we've seen in the last 2 years in particular, the Ukrainians have been very clever at using this to attack large munitions locations of the Russians, and more recently in their economic warfare against Russia, attacking every element of their oil and refining capability across the country. And we're now seeing what I call a next generation drone war, where drones are fighting drones. We're seeing maritime drones shoot down aerial drones. We're seeing drone interceptors being used against Shaheds, and I'll talk about that a little bit shortly. We're seeing aerial drones fight drones on the ground and vice versa. So we're seeing drones carry other drones. So this is the next generation of drone warfare, not just about humans operating drones to attack other humans and equipment. It's drones attacking other drones. It's drones attacking Russian soldiers and clearing out Russian positions without Ukrainian soldiers being involved in the direct combat. So this is a really important trend in drone warfare beyond just the cool drone technology. And it has resulted in the world's first drone force that's the equal of the Army, Navy and Air Force in Ukraine. The Russians obviously copied that because they like to be fast followers. They generally don't invent these things themselves. But the Unmanned Systems Force, and I've had the opportunity to speak with the commander in Ukraine about this, is becoming the central nervous system for drone operations across all the military services in Ukraine. And it's, once again, it's not just about the technology. It's about the collection of lessons from the battlefront, the standardisation of doctrine and training, the filling of gaps on the battlefield, the construction of the drone wall, the conduct of long-range strike, and the integration of tactical lessons with Ukrainian and foreign industries. I think it's a very interesting organisational response to drone technologies and battlefield lessons that we might learn from. It doesn't mean we all need to go out and form independent drone services, but the way the Ukrainians have done this is very interesting. And finally, with drones, we're starting to see drone barrier systems. The Ukrainians obviously are constructing their 1,100-kilometre long drone wall or drone line, which is about a 40 kilometre thick series of drones all the way along the eastern front. The Europeans are starting to look at it. And now in the Pacific, Indo-PACOM and PAC-Fleet are developing their Hellscape concept, which is shifting from a concept to actual implementation with drones on the ground this year. So all these things are really important aspects of contemporary drone operations that look beyond just the drones themselves. And drones, as you know, also have AI in them, but AI itself is having a profound impact on society as well as military affairs. I've had the opportunity to visit quite a few US and allied military organisations just to see what they're doing with the implementation of AI. And in some organisations, AI is penetrating deeply into many of the processes they use on a day-to-day basis. I guess one of the leaders, who are at the forefront of this is Admiral Paparo, what he is doing at Indo-PACOM. And their agentic planning in their J5 is developing thousands of options in their planning processes which they can simulate. It's compressing the time for targeting packages, compressing kill chains. It's allowing better personnel and logistic planning. But it's also, in many organisations, and not just friendly ones, generating material for strategic influence as well as misinformation and propaganda. I still think we're at the tip of the iceberg in the use of AI for misinformation and propaganda. I think there's a long way to go, but this will be one of the critical applications of it. This is one I think we're even less advanced in, but is going to be more profound in impact, where we all have our own personal AI assistants that help us through our careers. There's no reason that when you join the military, you're allocated your own algorithm that helps you track your career with training courses, with development, with a whole range of administrative systems. Everyone should have these when they join the military. It should be like a set of boots and a weapon. You should have your own personal AI assistant that stays with you through your entire career. Obviously, AI is being used more now for guiding and teaming of machines in the battlefield, whether it's on the ground, in the air, or in the maritime environment. That is only going to continue. In one of my visits to Ukraine a couple of years ago, they just cracked the last mile targeting with the use of AI. That is going to continue to be very important, not just in Ukraine, but in places like the Pacific, where the wide open spaces are going to see more of our communications denied, and the environmental impacts of rain, of humidity and jungles are going to require even higher levels of autonomy from our drone systems. But ultimately, I think AI is going to have the biggest impact on the third element of what I call the transformation drivers for modern war, and that is adaptation. Our previous discussant up on the stage here talked about how in the last few years we've seen both Ukraine and Russia learn how to learn better. And I think that's a very important thing that we need to study in them, because it's not just about learning and adapting, it's learning how to do that better, learning how to do it more quickly, learning how to do it in a way where the various elements within a military and between a military, government and industry are better connected. Ukraine provides us with a great case study in the importance of adaptation in a military organisation, and it is now running at a speed that most of our bureaucrats in Western democracies would find incomprehensible. We're seeing the redevelopment, the refresh of capabilities, such as long-range cruise missiles, on a basis where we're seeing new systems every couple of months. We couldn't even write a requirement in most of our militaries in a couple of months. They're developing these things and rolling them out really quickly. And this speed of adaptation that is being witnessed in Ukraine means that the military that we are building now in your country and mine will not be the one that wins the next war. It might start it, but it will be an entirely different military every step of the way. And I visit Ukraine a couple of times each year, and I've seen that every time I go, it is a different war and there's a different Ukrainian military because the speed of adaptation is moving so quickly. Another great example of this in Ukraine is the counter-drone and ballistic missile adaptation spiral. I developed this based on multiple interviews with a bunch of different Ukrainian air defenders, including the commander of their air defence. And in 2022, the Ukrainians lost a lot of their air defence radars, and they had to develop a whole new system, and a very clever university physicist came up with this system where they use about 14,000 iPhones as an acoustic detection system. And ever since then, the Ukrainians have integrated military and scientific effort to respond to Russian advances in the kinds of missiles and drones they're using, the scale, the tactics, and the technologies that are constantly changing. This is a daily battle that is underpinned by AI in both sharing awareness and learning from every single engagement. Once again, it is an adaptation approach that is probably beyond the comprehension of most of the bureaucrats in our nations, and we must get our heads around it. We've seen Russian tactical adaptation. The Russians are not stupid. Our future adversaries will not be stupid. One of the case studies is the turtle tank. A lot of people laughed at it. I didn't, because it was a serious attempt by the Russians to solve a compelling problem on the battlefield, that being getting from an assembly area to the break-in battle across contested terrain, physically, but also in the EW fight. Now, it's not the ultimate solution, but as an example of Russian learning and problem solving, we must assume that our adversaries are capable at least of similar learning and adaptation. Obviously, the Ukrainians have set the bar very high for tactical learning and adaptation in Ukraine. And as we've seen more recently, one of the big adaptations has been to extend the capacity of their limited people in the military. When I say limited, I mean numbers comparatively to the Russians, by the infusion of now literally millions of drones each year. And there's a whole range of other examples. But once again, this is an area where adaptation is spinning so quickly. On my last visit, I spent some time down on the Eastern Front and in a little underground bunker with a Ukrainian brigade commander. We were talking about how quickly things are changing. The Russians change their tactics every month. The Ukrainians are having to change their tactical doctrine to respond every month. How often do our armies change their tactical doctrine? I can tell you it's not that quick. And there's also been a bunch of strategic adaptations which we can learn from. Some have gone well, some not so well. Whether it's the mobilisation of industry, the mobilisation of people, the development of economic warfare models, coercion, and a whole range of things that are done at the national level in war. The Ukraine war offers us examples of not just adaptation, but examples of how it was done, how to do it better, where the Ukrainians and Russians have excelled at it and where they've made major mistakes. But I think the really compelling challenge that we have right now is the adaptation battle between Ukraine and Russia has now metastasised into what I'd call a global adaptation war. Our adversaries, or potential adversaries, Russia, North Korea, China and Iran, now collaborate in learning. They are sharing lessons on a daily basis. And it's not just about the use of drones. It's about constructing factories that can do it more efficiently. It's about how they can avoid economic sanctions. It's about how they can avoid the detection of new weapons of mass destruction and other capabilities they're building. Now, this is a reasonably new construct, and it's something that's happening not in real time, but when one learns, all can learn. In 2005, I worked for US Army headquarters in Baghdad, and while I was there, we saw the initial arrival of insurgents using explosively formed projectiles in their IEDs. And this had a really devastating impact because the average number of casualties per incident went up. The next year, I took an Australian task force to Afghanistan, fully expecting that I would see these things in southern Afghanistan where we were. I didn't see them, and it really shocked me. The world is not like that anymore. We will see good ideas used to kill our people, transmitted between our adversaries much more quickly and much more effectively in future, and we must be able to counter that. Finally, when it comes to adaptation, institutions need to understand, well, what stage of adaptation am I in? Am I in peacetime adaptation? What does that mean for risk-taking and process? Am I adapting in war? You'll understand that. But a third part of adaptation that I think we understudy and is understudied in the literature is the adaptation from peace to war. And there's an important reason why it's understudied, because there's not a lot of technology involved. It's entirely cognitive, and it's generally about how societies think, how quickly they can readjust the mindset of citizens and politicians from the world that no longer exists, the peacetime one, to the new world, which is the wartime one. And this is an area where I think we need to invest more more investigation, more research, and more preparation for. Because at some point in our futures, we are going to have to go through this, and the better we can do that, the more efficiently we do that, the better place we'll be to win the next conflict. So AI, autonomy, and adaptation are what I call an interactive trinity, and these are the big three things, the big three new things, I believe, that are driving transformation in military organisations around the world. Now, I'll finish with just some of the risks and opportunities. There are clear risks with some of these technologies in the implementation. Now, there's a bunch of wonderful speakers that are coming after me throughout the whole day that I think will go through some of the technological issues and risks. For me, the big risks are about using AI to speed up and improve our decision making, but in doing so, creating gaps between the military and other organisations. For example, might it create larger gaps between politicians and the military? That's a problem. Might it create larger gaps between the US military and its allies? That's a problem. And I think the big risk I always think about when it comes to these transformative elements is, what do the bad guys know that we don't? All right, I'd like to finish with the opportunities. I think there's a huge number of opportunities. That's why we're all here today, I think, to look at the opportunities. AI-supported drone adaptation, I think, will be crucial. We collect lessons at the moment, and every time I go to Ukraine, I ask them, what are your adaptation mechanisms and processes, and the answers get better. But I think there is huge potential for AI to be used in that adaptation process. There's huge potential for it to be able to aggregate, to analyse and feed lessons back into industry. I think there's opportunity for AI to translate lessons from Ukraine to the other theatres that we will be working, because Eastern Ukraine is not the Pacific. Eastern Ukraine is not the singular future of war, even though all the trends from there will influence all forms of future war. We need mechanisms to take what we've learned from Ukraine, filter it for the Pacific or Africa or South America or wherever else we might work, and ensure those lessons are fit for purpose depending on those regional conditions. I think AI can help us with this process. And finally, this transformative trinity of AI, autonomy and adaptation being applied together will help us solve some of the very compelling operational problems we face at the moment. One of the truisms of this war is defensive operations are now the stronger form of military operation, at least in Ukraine. Okay, at least in Ukraine. We need to change that, because it's very hard to have a conventional deterrent if all you can do is defend. You need to go on the offence. You need to be able to threaten an adversary if you're going to deter them from making major miscalculations. But there's a bunch of other problems that we need to solve for modern war as well, whether it's survivable, logistics sustainment, degrading enemy awareness to ensure that we might still be able to deceive and surprise them. There's a whole range of things that this trinity might help us solve for modern military institutions that have traditionally been solved purely by humans, but I think the combination of new technologies can help us move forward. But I think it always should be at the front of our minds that this combination of autonomy, AI and adaptation is not about replacing humans in war. Without humans, it's not war. It's some kind of transaction. So humans are always going to be part of this, whether it's the politicians making policy decisions or soldiers doing the business at the coalface. These new technologies don't replace them, but they extend everything they can potentially do. But to fully realise the potential of these technologies, just as our two previous speakers have said, will rely on human creativity, the artistic intelligence that some talk about as the other AI, and taking much, much more risk with procurement, with experimentation, with new ideas and new organisations. And most importantly, this will all be founded on good leadership. Adaptation to our organisations, to our technologies, to our ideas won't just happen It absolutely must be led. I've put up here a book by the finest leader I ever got to work for in Iraq, General Martin Dempsey. He talks about responsible rebellion. And he has a whole chapter in his book that talks about this concept about never accepting the status quo, but also understanding you can never get rid of everything that goes before you. That rebellion, that innovation, that adaptation can be done responsibly, but quickly at the same time. So getting all this right is really, really hard. I think General Rainey was very clear about that. Getting this right is extraordinarily hard when we have a peacetime mindset, deep, sometimes obstructive bureaucracies, and quite frankly, a lack of threat perception in many of our citizens. So it's really, really hard to do. But I tell you what's harder. Losing is much, much harder. And we've had enough examples of what strategic failure looks like in the last 3 years that should steel our minds and steel our hearts to be able to innovate and move more quickly to ensure that our military personnel have the right tools, physical and intellectual, to get the job done and defend our freedoms in future. So thank you very much for your time and your attention this morning. Thank you again to the great team at SCSP who's invited me here. It's been a privilege to work with them over the last couple of years, and I wish you all well for your discussions for the remainder of today.